Well, folks, we are about to bring on our good friend Paul onto the program. Paul, how are you doing, friend?
I'm good. Great to be here.
Dude,
Paul.
really stoked that you're joining us, folks. You know, Paul's a man of many talents. Paul is a former candidate for office. You also know Paul's work on the Jacobin Show and Jacobin Magazine, and Paul is also an organizer for the Teamsters for Democratic Union. Paul, really, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening.
Yeah, great to be here. And I got to say, since the last time we hung out in Austin, I can't stop thinking about Texas barbecue.
I'm glad. No, Paul came, and of course, he came during another one of our. They don't happen all the time, folks, but like a cataclysmic winter storm, and like the entire city was shut down, except for a couple places. I think we still had a good time. Um,
And there was
but when we were there, sorry,
no precipitation where we were. So
dude. I mean, I don't know. This is behind the scenes, but I'm still dealing with the fallout. I had to cut down a tree the other day that came down during the storm. Still dealing with that. But when Paul was here, he was talking about somebody who I think people should know, and that's Tony Mazzocchi, who is a very incredible labor leader. And I figured, you know, this might just be one of many segments where we're sort of looking at Tony's work. But I figured no better person to come on and talk about this than somebody who's one influenced by him, but somebody who actually does this kind of work than Paul. And like, you know, Paul, if you could, for our audience, could you explain to them who Tony is, just generally, and maybe why he's such an influence on you and other people on the left?
yeah, I mean, he really, I think, is one of the great heroes of the left. I think there was an article in Jacobin Kilpatrick wrote about Mazzocchi, and he said, you know, in a future socialist society, we'd have a statue of Mazzocchi, and I definitely think that's true. So, you know, he was a leader in the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, and he really played a big role in many kind of.
Oh no, we're missing Paul. He'll be back in a second. I hear him.
Yeah,
No worries.
there we go. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Paul. Sorry about that.
No worries. So yeah, he played a key role in many labor battles. So I mean, what he's known for on the one hand is his sort of blend of labor and environmentalism. I mean, he coined the term and the approach of a just transition. So the idea that we have to move away from fossil fuels, but in the process we have to make sure workers are taken care of. And
Mhm.
we can maybe get more into this, but he was was a World War II veteran and benefited from the GI Bill. And part of the GI Bill, besides being able to go to college for free, you got weekly unemployment benefits for up to a year. And they were pretty generous.
Mm.
And you could stagger them. I mean, you could work 2 months and decide, screw this, I'm going to go on vacation, use the GI Bill for a month, and then go back to work and then use the GI Bill. So he did that. I mean, it's really hard to imagine this today, given the state of our welfare state or lack of it. But he used that and it was inspired by this idea. I mean, he saw it was possible to do this on a broad scale and said, we should do this for workers, in the chemicals industry, fossil fuel industry, make sure they're paid their same salary. There's different schemes you
Mhm.
think about 4 years or something like that while they are transitioned to something new, or, if they're going to be, retired, be able to retire at their full pay. So he kind of coined that term. He was very influential in that. He helped fight to pass OSHA. OSHA was a result of a struggle that Mazzocchi helped to lead. So he was kind of a pioneer in that sense, but also, towards the end of his life, he led the effort to form a Labor Party in the 1990s. Now, obviously, this was not successful, but it was a very serious effort. I mean, this had real institutional support from the labor movement. A lot of locals and national unions signed on. So, it was a real effort that I think there's a lot to learn from that. But he was really the driving force and leader of that effort. So, I think those kind of two worlds is really, to sum up in short, what makes him so important. But he was also a leader in getting unions against the Vietnam War.
Mm.
That's kind of underplayed in his history. But I think really what stands out is his kind of blend of working class environmentalism that he not only kind of he theorized about. I mean, he didn't really write anything, but he really put into practice and got And it's kind of ironic because he worked in like literally maybe the most
Yeah.
toxic industry. I mean, and some of the workers in his union are building nuclear weapons, and he's yet, even though representing them, also talking about, getting rid of nuclear weapons and getting rid of these toxic industries. So kind of incredible to be able to do those two things at the same time, and he was able to do that.
And like a lot of the work that he did, I think, is like pertinent, not just in the general sense of like union organizing, but as you're saying, the environmental stuff. I mean, I'm just borrowing this from somebody, a friend of the show, and a huge influence on me, Matt Huber, in his book,
Right.
which everyone should read, "Climate Changes, Class War." That Tony has this incredible line. He says, why do we treat dirt better than we treat workers? And what he's talking about there is that when you clean up, I don't know, I put quotations marks over that, but like when you clean up, industrial sites, like we have all of these very strict laws and regulations for how we deal with that. Where is that for the working people? And I think that that's like something that has been sort of missing, unfortunately, for a while on the environmental movement, and that like Tony, in revisiting his work, really brings it back. But there's another aspect to this, and you wrote an article in Jacobin, Paul, that I think that like really like brings him back up to a lot of the fights that we're having right now, which is about suburban politics, right? And you have an article in Jacobin, Paul, called how Tony Mazzocchi built worker militancy in the suburbs. And I was just wondering, if you could talk about that a little bit, because this is like earlier in his career, if I'm correct, right? The way
Yeah.
he was able to do that is unique, and I think is like a decent model to start to look at now, when so much of the workforce is sort of like in these areas versus like in the more traditional urban environment.
Right. Yeah, and I think this really gets back to the principle he had throughout his entire political life. It really was based on the same kind of organizing principle, and I think it's the same principle we should all adopt, is that, you have to be able to build a base first before advancing more radical
Hmm.
demands. You got to take care of the day-to-day bread and butter issues, and he was able to do that and be very radical in a way without sounding radical or sounding scary, and just doing it through this basic trade unionism. And that's what he was able to do. Now, I will say, I mean, one benefit he had, so we're talking about now the early 1950s. And what makes this kind of incredible is that, 1950s, the, anti-communist hysteria is at its height. You're talking soon after there was purges in the labor movement where a lot of radicals or open communists were purged. And the factory that he had been working in New York City is now moved out to the suburbs, and really for the explicit reason of trying to kind of like suppress this worker militancy. Now, one thing I would say he had on his side was, there was a deep working class culture and trade union culture. I mean, he's coming of age at a time, 1945, 35% of U.S. workers are in unions. That is a
Hmm.
third of the workforce. Today, it is at 10%. In the post-war World War II strike wave, you have over 4 million workers participated in that. So, and in a book that was written about him, really incredible book called "The Man Who Hated Work and Loved Labor," by Les Leopold. Truly one of the best books I've ever read. Goes into this, but he kind of grew up in this dense working class culture, and a lot of people did. So that did help him because the people he's organizing, they still remember that. They're still a part of that. But he kind of just takes the approach of like, we are going to first address the shop floor issues, whether that's
Hmm.
two-tier wage structure. He also did something I think pretty creative where they're preparing for a strike, in their own shop. They start preparing over a year in advance. And part of what they do is he sends members to go visit other picket lines. And these, back in the day when a picket line was really a picket line where you're fighting scabs and the cops. But he would send his workers who hadn't been on strike to those picket lines to kind of get that experience, and it increases their confidence. And then management has to
Hmm.
see workers coming in late every morning after being on a picket line, some of them bruised up, and it kind of starts to intimidate management, and it gives workers confidence. So just doing simple things like that. But he also took education really seriously. And another incredible thing he did, he's working mostly with people who didn't even graduate high school. And Mazzocchi himself, didn't go to college, but he did believe deeply that there needs to be an education component. People need to see this as being part of a bigger movement, not just about winning higher wages, but this is part of a bigger transformation that we're a part of. And so he starts a reading group that soon becomes really popular. I mean, they're reading Plato's Republic, you know, in the shop, and they're talking about it. People are excited about it. They read a book about the civil rights movement, and that inspired them to start pushing to hire Black workers where they weren't being hired before. So he adds this, educational element that I think really draws people in. And also, he just made organizing really fun. A lot of people talk about this. He was fun to be around. He made things interesting. The book talks about he starts this bowling league that becomes really popular. And I'll take this moment to say this. I don't want to turn this show into a thing about cancel culture, but this part of the book made me think about, I think on the left, we have a very puritanical culture, if I'm being honest. In the bowling league, what was kind of compelling was that it was raunchy. People were getting drunk. There were, I'm not condoning extramarital affairs, but there was, affairs happening. There was sort of a sexual thing to it too. But you could imagine it was kind of a scene where, people are making dirty jokes. It's like funny, it's fun. And I feel like there is a certain puritanical element to the left right now where, I don't know, that environment doesn't really happen, or people don't feel able to do that. But that was, I think, a very big part of the culture was people are having fun. It's a good time. It wasn't overly serious. And so, he just went from the shop floor issues to just getting, I think more and more broad. They start their own health clinic. They're one of the first locals to win dental benefits in the entire country. They start running their own credit union. And then, once he was able to take care and show they could deal with the bread and butter issues, they defeated two-tier proposal. They start winning these amazing benefits. Then he was able to start bringing up broader issues. Then he's starting to hold forums about nuclear testing. He got his members to bring in their kids' baby teeth because they were going to do testing on, the effects of nuclear bomb testing. But it was only after building that base first and showing, and not doing it through sloganeering or being a dogmatic person, but taking care of that first, gaining trust, gaining credibility, and then he was able to go far with that and bring up so many political issues that probably these same members in the past wouldn't have been responsive to. So I think that was a key part of that approach.
Well, I just want to highlight again, if y'all don't mind, just reading from your piece, Paul, how raunchy these bowling parties seem to be. The bowling league was the graveyard for young marriages. It's trained traditional 1950s, which I also think that we have to maybe understand that probably bowling had a different connotation than it does for us today, because I usually don't attribute those bowling to like sexual depravity, but the bowling leagues was.
You've never had a bowling alley affair, David? Well, but I mean, I think like that's interesting. Like the people were hungering for one, like fun, and also like sort of intellectual community. Right, with the like, it's not a surprise. Like all these guys, I can't remember this guy's name, but he's like a not Joe Rogan type, but he's like in that sort of crew, and he's always talking about how great it is we have 4-hour conversations, and it's like that's cool, yeah. But it's like when it can be like with people, like fellow workers around like those sorts of ideas, is a little bit better than just like idly talking about AI or something like the next fad. But yeah, I thought that was a very interesting point, and not a surprise. But it's just like now, where do you go to have that kind of fun? Like concerts cost like $400 a piece. Like
Right.
I guess there are bowling alleys. Like yeah.
And and I mean, this is something, and it wasn't just Mazzocchi. I mean, I think the unions in their heyday, especially in the 30s, 40s, they were great at thinking about the social lives. So unions had their own baseball leagues, basketball leagues. They would sponsor dances. They understood that was really important. I think it still is. I mean, not to the same degree, but unions are potential sites of that. And it's going to look different. I mean, in Philadelphia, the Teamsters local, they had a thing recently where they had like a video game competition at the Union Hall as a way to reach some of the younger members. And it was kind of an experiment. It brought some new people out, but it can be a really powerful thing. And part of this was a deliberate approach, because it used to be, before these unions started growing, the companies dominated the social lives. So the companies would have their own softball leagues that workers would go to, and unions figured out that if we want to kind of take back control from the company, we're going to have to provide our own social spaces. And
Mhm.
I think Tony Mazzocchi did that really well.
I mean, could you talk a little bit more about the political education aspect here too? Because like that's another one that I think on the contemporary left that you get a lot, which is like, like history and theory is effectively like it's for eggheads. It's of no interest to like everyday people, and like any kind of like feeling that like that should be like a part of a socialist program. It's just trying to be exclusive, trying to keep people. I mean, could you talk about how Tony was able to set something out that wasn't set up to sort of be like, oh, well, I have the knowledge, you don't got the knowledge, and actually like foster like a strong sense of camaraderie and deeper understanding about politics and labor.
Yeah, and I think this story of it should kind of give us a lot of hope, because again, we're talking about a workforce that was many did not even graduate high school. So
Yeah.
many of us would probably maybe assume that there's no way a reading group would do well in this local, but it really did. And I think part of what the approach was too was to deal with kind of the compelling issues of the day. And he would also kind of appoint people to, hey, go to this meeting. A. Philip Randolph is speaking, and come back and report to the membership. And then that person kind of gets more interested in what's going on, and just dealing with whatever current issues is. Don't just be, well, I'm the president of the union, I'm going to go and give the information back. Get other members to start absorbing this stuff. And to mention it again, I think a very inspiring example was them, a group of white workers reading a book about the civil rights movement, and then being inspired to say, hey, we should, in our own company, they don't allow black workers in this certain occupations. Let's fight for that. And they actually, uh, the majority of the membership actually was against it, but this kind of the leadership group took a stand and kind of forced it through. And this actually happened a lot with these kind of issues, even though there was kind of a big initial backlash from white workers. Very soon after, they kind of just get over it, and it becomes pretty accepted. But this was all kind of stimulated by a reading group. I mean, one current
Mhm.
example we have of that, go back to the Chicago teachers strike of 2012. That all started, that reform movement in the Chicago Teachers Union started with a reading group where they read, I think it was Shock Doctrine by Noam Klein. They read a few other things. So, we shouldn't underestimate the ability for reading and that kind of intellectual engagement to really spark real life organizing.
You also note in your piece too, like the merging of like labor with the political scene, and I'll just quote from something that Miyazaki said in to Leopold during the when they're writing the book. Quote: the union had to be more than a shop floor institution; it had to have a broader political understanding. I mean, I understood that corporations dominated the political scene, and that if you were going to fight effectively, people had to understand ideologically the need to deal with this huge corporate sector. I knew when I became president of the local, it was a fight for the minds of the people. I mean, could you talk maybe a little bit about like Tony's experience with this, and to maybe like from your own perspective, like being able to tie like these labor fights to like the political world where like corporations and corporate power really dominate?
Yeah, and I think this kind of comes into play with his approach to occupational safety and health, because for him, it was also this power issue. So, these companies have the ability to just determine what materials and chemicals we're going to work with. Doesn't matter the impact on workers or the broader community. So kind of saw the fight for OSHA, which, by the way, he understood OSHA was very limited
Hmm.
also. But he understood those fights as being, obviously for safety and health of people, but it's also about taking control back. And if these companies can just kind of have free reign to make us work in whatever conditions, that's taking away a lot of our power. And I think increasingly he saw, um, the reach of the corporate sector. In the book it talks about as early as the late 1960s, he already saw that a lot of the chemical and oil plants his members worked in were very much automated, even to the point where
Mm.
a strike actually didn't affect them much. And so how he got around that was building up these broader anti-corporate campaigns that involved a lot of public support and public shaming. So I think he always just saw that, like, if we kind of don't attack that broader political element, we're always going to be a step behind, and that I think eventually is what led him to the Labor Party idea.
Mhm.
And there's a great video on YouTube. I know I sent it to you, David. I think it's a video of him in like 1989 or something, talking about at one of his early Labor Party meetings. And he said, which I think this all audience understands, is that it's getting to the point like we can't bargain for good healthcare anymore. And he said, I challenge
Mhm.
any union leader, even the best of them, and this is back in again the late '80s, to be able to make improvements on the healthcare plan. Whereas in Western Europe and other places, they're bargaining with the state, and we have to get to the we're reaching the point where if we don't have a political reflection of the labor movement, we can be the best union organizers in the world, but we're going to get isolated and defeated. So I think that understanding kind of pushed them to this idea: we need to have some kind of labor party in this country. And again, I mean, this is an idea we all think this. Of course, he's been the person most recently to. Again, it still failed, but he got, I think, the furthest along than anyone's been able to get
Mhm.
in a very long time in this country.
I mean, not trying to pour cold water on it. I feel like probably further than any of the other demands. Like people say, "Oh, we need a third party. We need a labor party in this country." Like we all agree, but like Tony actually had like the relationship and the embeddedness in labor to maybe start to build something that probably is more sustainable than, I don't know, some of the proposals we hear from folks today. That's just sort of like, I got a logo and a website, and we're gonna
Right.
have a labor party.
Yeah, and I really encourage people, because again, this is coming up. I mean, for very good reason. Like we all feel this need, like we need a labor party.
Hmm.
So I totally understand it. But I really encourage people to read. Jacobin did an interview a long time ago with Mark Dudzik, who also came out of the same union, worked with Mazzocchi. Dudzik was also the head of labor for single payer. But interview with him, I think it's called "What Happened to the Labor Party." I think it's
Hmm.
really good for people to read, just for the context, to just see that it's not just about us like wishing it to happen, or we can't really. It's not just about willing it to happen. Like there were a lot of structural factors that even made this like a possibility of a thought in the '90s, and it was also, I think, many structural reasons of why it ultimately failed. But I think it would be, people should look into that history, because I think it shows that it's not just about us wishing it. There has to kind of be more things in motion for it to really become a reality.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like more than anything, it's just like you have to build the community, you have to build the class, right? And like
Right.
that's sort of what Tony's like entire like organizing strategy seemed to be about. It was like, even in a place that's unionized, like you have to start to develop that consciousness within the union, and that's why you do things. And like I love, like personally, like I mean, there's so much to love about Tony's work, but like the idea of actually like showing up to other picket lines, not only in the sense of like what you were highlighting about like how it gives people experience, it's intimidating your bosses, but it also is just like building this kind of cross shop solidarity with people, right? It's like we're all in this fight together, which I think is something that's desperately needed.